Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Just a warning, there is graphic information covered in this episode. Episode 152, Sergeant Griffin, Part 2. If you haven't already done so, please go back and listen to Part 1 of this episode. It outlines the background of Thomas Griffin, and it leads us to the night where we have the troopers and Griffin camping on the Mackenzie River. During the night, the publican Arthur Bedford was awakened by what he perceived to be a shot from a revolver. He looked at his watch and found it to be close to 2 o'clock. As he lay between sleeping and waking, Bedford heard another shot and looked at his watch again, found it to be 3:30 in the morning. Griffin arrived at the hotel about half an hour later. The Assistant Gold Commissioner looked tired and said he had missed his way and was guided up by the crowing of Bedford's cocks. Bedford asked about the revolver shots he'd heard, and Griffin replied that Power had gone out looking for the horses, had missed his way and fired a shot to attract the camp. Griffin also denied the earlier gunshot had occurred. Medical testimony at Griffin's trial indicated that Trooper Power had been shot in the back of the head, with the ball exiting over his right eye. Trooper Cahill was shot on the top of his head, and the bullet came out behind his left ear. It is believed that the men had been stupefied by some narcotic and shot whilst in a state of stupor from its effects. After he murdered the two men, Griffin extracted the money from the wrappings, which were burnt in the campfire, rolled the bundles of cash into a blanket before proceeding to Bedford's hotel. Griffin and Bedford started on the road to Rockhampton at 5 o'clock on November the 6th. Unbeknownst to Bedford, Griffin was carrying the stolen escort money tied up in a blue blanket and took care to ride behind Bedford on the journey. About 4 miles from Ashcroft's, one of the bundles fell out onto the road. Griffin dismounted, picked up the bundle and told Bedford to ride on. He then went into the bush beside the road and secured the bundles of cash more tightly in the blanket and strapped it to his saddle. That evening they arrived at Beattie's Hotel at Gainsford. The next day they rode to Westwood, which had a rail connection to Rockhampton. The two men completed the journey by taking the train to Rockhampton, arriving there at night. Griffin transferred the stolen money into a valise, which was left at Mrs. Otley's residence. Between 10 and 12 o'clock on the following day, on the 8th of November, Griffin, Bedford and a man named Hornby were drinking at the Commercial Hotel in Rockhampton. Griffin paid for drinks with a £1 note that was later identified as being part of the escort money. On the afternoon of the 8th of November, news reached Rockhampton of the discovery of the bodies of the troopers Power and Cahill near their campsite on the Mackenzie River. It was too late to start for the scene that night, but preparations were made by Sub-Inspector Elliott to form a party to travel to the Mackenzie crossing the next morning. Initial reports of the tragedy were that the troopers had been poisoned after the discovery of several pigs that died after eating what the troopers had vomited. On Saturday morning, 9th of November, as the party to investigate the deaths assembled at the train station, the bank manager Thomas Hall remarked to Griffin, "However did those two fellows get the poison? I cannot make it out." Griffin replied, "They are not poison. It's all a trumped-up yarn, a false report. They are shot, and you will see if they are not." He made a fatal error by talking too loosely and too frequently. The police report stated the men had been poisoned. Griffin, however, declared that they'd been shot. Naturally, the police officers wanted to know how Griffin knew, and instantly their suspicions were aroused. Griffin did not leave on the train with the group of police and bank officers, but told them he'd follow them to Westwood by the 11 o'clock train. He then returned to Mrs. Otley's, retrieved the valise, and went to find a spot to hide the stolen cash. The money was hidden in the hollow of a burnt stump in the bush 20 yards off the road and about half a mile from Mrs. Otley's residence. After Griffin joined the party of men at Westwood, they departed for the Mackenzie crossing on horseback. Dr. David Salmond, unable to ride, travelled in a gig. Sub-Inspector Elliott had harboured suspicions about Griffin when news of the deaths were received. So apparently at a wayside hotel, the police inspector induced Griffin to have a few drinks. By arrangement with the hotel proprietor, when asked for gin, he was given only water, but Griffin was provided with the real goods. When the Gold Commissioner was sleepy and almost drunk, Inspector Elliott removed his pistols, took out the detonators from the bullets, and poured water into the nipples to dampen the powder. The group of men arrived at Mackenzie Crossing about 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday, November the 11th. At the campsite, the bodies of Power and Cahill had been temporarily buried. The remains were exhumed to enable Dr. Selmond to make a post-mortem examination. Shortly afterwards, Dr. Selmond told Sub-Inspector Elliott, "I have found bullet wounds in the heads of these men." Elliott cautioned the doctor to keep that information to himself at the present time. He then approached Detective Kilfeeder and advised him that he intended to arrest Griffin. Kilfeeder engaged Griffin in conversation, and at a pre-arranged signal, the police seized Griffin by the wrists and handcuffed him. Elliott said, "I arrest you on suspicion of having murdered John Power and Patrick Cahill." Griffin drew in a long breath, which was half a groan, and said quietly, "Well, I could only expect it, as I was the last person known to be in the company of the poor fellows." The party adjourned to Bedford's Hotel, where an inquiry into the murders was commenced, conducted by Henry Abbott, the general manager of the AJS Bank in Queensland, who was the only justice of the peace present. At the inquiry, information was elicited regarding the discovery of the bodies. During Bedford's absence, the hotel was left in charge of a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Mid-morning on Thursday, November the 6th, after Griffin and Bedford had departed for Rockhampton, Mrs. Peterson went across to the camp to retrieve a billy she'd lent to the men. She saw one of the men, who appeared to be lying asleep on his blankets. She called out, but receiving no reply, turned to the hotel and told her husband the troopers were asleep at their camp. The next morning, John Peterson was out looking for horses and passed by near the camp. He noticed a bad smell and went to investigate when he discovered the two troopers lying dead within a few feet of each other. Mr. Armstrong had arrived at the hotel in the previous afternoon, rode to the native police barracks at the Mackenzie River near Wilpen Station, and informed Sub-Inspector the officer in charge of the discovery. Acting Sub-Inspector Stokes was the first policeman on the scene, arriving at the campsite in the afternoon. Attended the scene later that afternoon and concluded the troopers had been poisoned. He hurried off to report the incident, riding 100 miles in 10 hours with one arm in a sling. When he arrived at Gainsford, Constable Moynihan, who was stationed at that township, conveyed Ear's written report to Sub-Inspector Elliott in Rockhampton. Dr. Selmond told the inquiry that both men had been shot through the head, but he was unable to ascertain whether they had previously been drugged. He'd taken the stomachs of the victims for analysis. Acting Sub-Inspector Stokes described the positions of the bodies lying side by side, their heads 9 feet apart and their feet 6 feet apart. Of their revolvers, one was fully loaded and the other one had one chamber empty from a recent discharge. In the fire, Stokes found charred remains of what appeared to be the covering of the parcels of banknotes. After hearing the evidence, Abbott decided there was enough to justify holding Griffin on remand in Rockhampton, and he was placed in the custody of Sub-Inspector and his troopers. The news of Griffin's arrest caused widespread excitement in Rockhampton. From the start, opinions in the community were greatly divided. Griffin's friends and supporters were convinced it was a trumped-up charge, and the arrest had been more officiousness on the part of Sub-Inspector Elliott. On the 17th of November, a great crowd assembled at the Rockhampton railway station to witness Griffin's arrival in handcuffs, but he was taken off the train at Yeppen on the outskirts of the township and conveyed to the lockup from there. After the news of Griffin's arrest on double murder charges and in the lead-up to his first appearance in court, the local press coverage of Griffin's arrest became a story of its own, with the editors of the Rockhampton's rival newspapers, the Rockhampton Bulletin and the Northern Argus, accusing each other of unprofessional reporting. On the 16th of November, prior to Griffin's arrival in custody back in Rockhampton, the editor of the Northern Argus accused its rival newspaper of pointing to Mr. Griffin as the perpetrator of the deed. The editorial in the Argus went on to express doubts about Griffin's guilt, saying, "The accused appears to us to be a victim of circumstances over which he had no control," adding the observation that an accident may have placed him in a position which might have been the fate of any one of us, and we trust that the public will accord him the benefit of the doubt. The Rockhampton Bulletin countered with an editorial on the 19th of November, which described the comments published in the Northern Argus as foolish and slanderous assertions, and accused the newspaper of committing the grave offence of defending Griffin, thus serving to arrogate the functions of advocate, judge and jury. Griffin was placed in the Rockhampton lockup under the charge of Constable McCulkin. Soon after his incarceration, Griffin asked McCulkin to post a letter for him, addressed to a woman in Melbourne. The constable agreed but took the letter directly to Sub-Inspector Elliott, who opened it and read the contents. Elliott then forwarded the letter, together with the particulars of Griffin's arrest, to the Chief Inspector of Police in Melbourne, asking him to make inquiries about the woman. By this means, Elliott soon afterwards received information about the existence of Griffin's wife, to whom Griffin had been paying an allowance since she discovered he was alive and living at Clermont. The inquiry that began at Bedford's Hotel at the Mackenzie Crossing was resumed in the Rockhampton Police Court on the 21st of November 1867. Griffin was brought before the bench, made up of the police magistrate and two other magistrates, one of whom was Henry Abbott, charged on suspicion with wilfully murdering John Power and Patrick Cahill, troopers of the Clermont Gold Escort. The public interest in the murders was so great that a crowd gathered to watch Griffin's first appearance in court. When the doors to the courthouse were opened, a rush of people entered the building in a desperate attempt to secure sitting or standing room, while people also crowded onto the veranda and around the windows to peer in from outside. Griffin's legal team consisted of Rees Rutland Jones and Henry John Milford. At the commencement, Milford asked if he could communicate privately with his client without the presence of a policeman, but the police magistrate denied his request. During the remainder of the proceedings, testimony from a number of witnesses was heard dealing with Griffin's arrest, the discovery of the bodies and descriptions of the murder scene. Sergeant Julian also gave evidence about Griffin's behaviour prior to departing for Clermont with Power and Cahill. During James Julian's testimony, the police sergeant expressed the opinion that Griffin had been in the first stages of delirium tremens. And this is a description of what commonly alcoholics experience when they are having a withdrawal. During the various aborted attempts to start for Clermont before he was dismissed, Julian thought that Griffin was eccentric in his orders, adding that, "I believe on the occasion he was mad, and I think he is mad now." At the conclusion of the depositions and examination of witnesses related to the initial inquiry, Sub-Inspector Elliott said he was not in a position to go on with the case and asked that the prisoner be remanded for a further 8 days. This was agreed to, and the prisoner was removed from the courtroom. The hearing recommenced on Thursday, November the 28th, before the police magistrate. Much of the day was taking up rereading depositions, insisted upon by Griffin's attorney. Evidence was then presented regarding the payment of cash to the 6 Chinese miners and Griffin's payment with a stolen note for drinks at the commercial hotel after his return to Rockhampton. Witnesses continued to be examined in the case over the following 2 days. At the conclusion of the proceedings on the 30th of November, Sub-Inspector Elliott asked for an additional remand of 8 days for the purpose of obtaining further evidence, and this again was granted. Additional evidence was presented in the police court on Monday, December the 9th, and the case for the prosecution concluded on the following day, on the 10th of December. The prisoner was asked if he had anything to say in answer to the charge brought against him. Griffin stated in a firm tone of voice, "I have, your worship, simply to say that I am entirely innocent of the charge which has been preferred against me. Had I been allowed the common privileges afforded to suspected felons, I should not, this day, be standing where I am, but under advice I reserve my defence." At the close of proceedings, Griffin was formally committed for trial at a sitting in the Supreme Court on the 16th of March 1868, and he was transferred to Brisbane Jail. In March 1868, Justice Alfred Lutwidge, accompanied by an unusually large number of barristers and other legal gentlemen, travelled from Brisbane to Rockhampton aboard the SS Leichhardt for the trial of Thomas Griffin. Thomas Griffin was transferred from Brisbane aboard the same steamer. Proceedings at the Rockhampton Circuit Court commenced on the 16th of March 1868, presided by Justice Lutwidge. Thomas John Griffin was indicted on the charge that he did, on the 6th of November 1867, at the Mackenzie River, feloniously, wilfully, and of malice, aforethought, kill and murder Patrick Cahill and John Power. When asked by the Clerk of Arraigns how he pleaded, Griffin emphatically replied not guilty. The prosecution was carried out by the Queensland Attorney-General Ratcliffe Pring and Charles Lilly, QC. Griffin's defence team consisted of the barristers Edward McDevitt, Henry Healing and Samuel Griffith, instructed by Henry Milford and Rees Jones. McDevitt and his 2 colleagues had formally undertaken to defend Griffin on March the 14th, 2 days before the trial was to commence. In view of the short time frame, McDevitt requested a postponement of 2 days, so he and his learned friends could have an opportunity of perusing the depositions and acquainting themselves to the circumstances of the case. Justice Lutwidge agreed with the request and remanded the prisoner until the 18th of March. A jury of 12 was impanelled and the trial resumed. a process that occupied a considerable time. In stating the case for the Crown, Attorney General Pring explained that a considerable mass of evidence, which by its character was circumstantial, would be presented to support the charge against the prisoner. He explained to the jury that circumstantial evidence was necessary in a court of justice in cases where the human eye may not have witnessed the perpetration of the deed. The first witness to be called was Sergeant James Julian. During Julian's testimony, Griffin's defence barrister, Edward McDevitt, objected to evidence of a robbery being presented, a charge on which the prisoner had not been indicted. He submitted this collateral fact of a robbery was inadmissible as evidence on the murder charge against the prisoner. However, the judge ruled that the evidence of the robbery was admissible. The trial was conducted over 6 days. 5 witnesses for the defence, including Mrs. Elizabeth Otley, gave evidence. The testimony of several of the defence witnesses represented an attempt to indicate Griffin was not in financial difficulty. In his summing up, which occupied 2 hours, McDevitt appealed to the jury in defence of the prisoner. He admitted that the facts raised a great suspicion of the prisoner's guilt, but warned the jury that they had to be certain beyond all reasonable doubt. The trial concluded on the 25th of March 1868. The summing up of the evidence by Justice Lutwidge occupied 4.5 hours. The jury retired at 10 minutes past 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Griffin was temporarily removed to the lock-up cell to await the verdict. After an hour, the jury returned to the courtroom and the foreman announced a verdict of guilty. The prisoner was then asked if he had anything to say why the sentence of death should not be passed upon him. Griffin rose to his feet, trembling with excitement for a moment, and then in a clear voice made a long, disconnected statement. After Griffin had finished, Justice Lutwidge addressed the prisoner directly, informing him that he had been found guilty of willful murder, a crime the judge described as unparalleled in the annals of Australian history. In regard to the quality of the evidence, Justice Lutwidge remarked, "I can say that sitting in my place here, I have never heard circumstantial evidence of guilt more satisfactory or more conclusive." The judge then pronounced a sentence of death upon Griffin. Justice Lutwidge appeared to be deeply affected at the conclusion of the address and was overcome with emotion, a feeling that communicated itself to many in the court. Several points of law were argued in Brisbane before the full bench of the Supreme Court on the 15th of May, but all were dismissed. With the conviction and sentence confirmed, the date of Griffin's execution was fixed for the 1st of June 1868. In his Rockhampton prison cell, the prisoner maintained a careless, nonchalant air. He ate and slept well and amused himself by reading novels. During the visits of his friends, Griffin generally appeared affected at first, but he quickly relapsed into a hard and indifferent mood. Griffin was visited by Anglican and Presbyterian clergymen, to whom he continued to maintain his innocence. A number of attempts were made to induce the prisoner to confess to the murders of Power and Cahill, but on each occasion he refused. About 2 weeks before his execution, Griffin made an attempt to escape from captivity by promising one of the jailers the money he'd stolen from the escort. The details of Griffin's escape plan and confession to the jailer, known as a turnkey, was only revealed after his execution. After Griffin had been informed that his death warrant had been signed, he began to attempt to convince the assistant turnkey, Alfred Grant, to help him escape, holding out to him hopes of receiving the lost money in return. He did this various times with hints and snatches of conversation, whenever he had the opportunity to speak to Grant alone. Grant was to endeavour to effect his escape, and if that failed, to procure for the prisoner poison or a knife so he could commit suicide. Grant reported Griffin's overtures to the principal turnkey, John Lee, and the 2 jailers arranged a routine that allowed the prisoner frequent opportunities to speak privately to Grant. Griffin's approach to Grant required an admission of guilt for the murders in order to convince the turnkey he knew of the location of the stolen cash. His account of what happened at the Mackenzie camp, a confession brought about in the hope of escape rather than from remorse, made it seem like Griffin had killed the troopers in self-defence. The editorial in the Northern Argus described Griffin's version of events as told to Grant as utterly false. On the 26th of May, Griffin gave Grant a pencil sketch of the locality where he'd hidden the stolen escort money. Grant was unacquainted with the locality. When he showed the map to John Lee, the principal turnkey, he was sceptical and told Grant that Griffin was making a fool of him, as the locality had already been thoroughly searched. The next day, Griffin asked Grant if he'd studied the map. The turnkey replied that he could not understand it and gave Griffin paper and pencil to give him a plainer one. When Grant compared the 2 maps, he later described that he found them alike in every respect. That evening, Grant asked Lee to accompany him to the location indicated by Griffin's maps. According to Grant's later account, Lee asked, "Should you find it, what do you intend to do with it?" and Grant replied that he intended to take it to the sheriff and ask him to exempt me from duty till after the execution. The two turnkeys went to the locality that evening, but the search was unsuccessful. On the evening of Saturday, May 30th, Grant and Lee returned to continue the search, but again without success. On the morning of the execution, the prisoner was attended by Reverend Smith. Griffin dressed with great care in evening attire. The hangman, John Hutton, who travelled from Brisbane to carry out the execution, entered the cell and pinioned the prisoner's arms to his side. At the foot of the gallows, Griffin knelt and engaged in prayers with the clergyman. During this time, the hangman stood a few feet from the prisoner with his back to him, and his head was turning every now and then impatiently, waiting for the length of the prayers. The hangman threw the noose from behind over Griffin's head as if to aid the executioner. He raised his chin, letting the rope be adjusted under his long fair beard, and stood under the beam. When the rope had been adjusted, he said, "Lord, have mercy on me." And then he said in reply to the executioner, "I would like to make you some present, but I have nothing. The police have all I had. If you see Mr. Brown, he'll give you something." On the scaffold, Hutton asked the condemned man if he wished to make a confession, to which he replied, "No, I have nothing to confess." Griffin changed a white pocket handkerchief, which he held in his left hand, to his right hand, and clutched it even in death. The white cap was placed in position, and as though impatient at any delay, Griffin said, "Go on, I am ready." Inside the jail grounds, the execution was witnessed by 60 people. Outside the walls, a considerable crowd had collected, including one person who climbed a tree to witness the hanging. Griffin was the first person to be executed in Rockhampton. The journalist for the Rockhampton Bulletin commented on his death, "As he lived, so has he died, hard, callous, and impenitent." Various souvenirs were collected after Griffin's execution. It's believed that the clothes that Griffin was hanged in, along with his beard, which was shaved off, went to the hangman John Hutton. Griffin's service medals went to a local solicitor, while his gold watch was sold to a slaughterman. The revolver he is said to have shot Cahill and Power with went to Corrales Station near Junda on the Thomson River, but was later destroyed in a fire. After Griffin's execution, Lee and Grant made a third unsuccessful attempt to find the money, in the process discovering that they'd been searching on the wrong road on the previous occasions. On their return, Grant remarked to the jailkeeper, Edward Shee, that he thought he had found the location of the stolen money, but I find I've been made a fool of. He then related the particulars of his interactions with Griffin. That evening, Shee mentioned the matter to the sheriff, Arthur Halloran, who asked Grant the following morning to show him the pencil sketches the prisoner had made. Halloran told Grant to go out again with somebody well acquainted with the place. During the conversation, the sheriff said, "I am sorry you did not tell me of it before the execution," to which Grant replied, "I cannot vouch for the truth of it now, and to obtain what I have obtained required the greatest secrecy." The next day, the AJS bank manager Thomas Hall and another man joined the search. The money inside a valise was eventually found inside a half-burned stump, with another stump placed up against it to cover the contents. On the 18th of June 1868, an inquiry was held at Rockhampton Jail regarding the conduct of the turnkeys Lee and Grant, with reference to Griffin's confession. All those involved in obtaining the confession and finding the stolen escort money were examined, but not on oath, and their statements forwarded to Brisbane for consideration of the government. In July 1868, it was reported that Lee and Grant had been dismissed from their positions. The report in the Northern Argus commented, "The minds of the community have been in such an excited state since the murder, for the commission of which the authorities are in some measure to blame, by having elected a man of Griffin's stamp to fill a position so onerous and responsible that nothing connected with the melancholy affair should be kept in the dark." In August 1868, a letter from Alfred Grant explaining the details from his point of view of Griffin's confession and the discovery of the stolen money was published in the Queenslander magazine. Now, there was a little bit of drama after the burial of Griffin. A week after the burial, the body was exhumed and then reburied. About the time of Griffin's execution, Robert Tucker, an undertaker and the sexton in charge of the Rockhampton Cemetery, reported a rumour to a member of the cemetery board to the effect that an attempt would be made to raise Griffin's body. On Sunday morning, June the 7th, the sexton discovered that the grave had been disturbed. After he reported the incident, 2 constables were placed on watch to protect the grave. The cemetery board met the next day, and at the conclusion of which a telegram was sent to the Colonial Secretary seeking permission to open the grave to ascertain the extent of the disturbance. Permission was granted. Upon opening, a headless corpse was revealed. The remains were then turned out of the coffin, with both doctors at the scene identifying the body of Griffin. At the conclusion of the examination of Griffin's body, it was returned to the coffin and restored in its resting place. From the outset, speculation was rife if the persons responsible for stealing Griffin's head were men with an interest in medicine and the science of phrenology who wished to study the shape of the murderer's skull in an attempt to find an explanation for the crime for which he was convicted. Years later, there were rumours that a well-known Rockhampton surgeon and a well-known mariner that had died several years prior to this report being in the paper. Both men were intimately acquainted with Griffin, and neither could possibly have been deceived as to the identity of the corpse. It said the doctor buried the head in the garden of a friend until an opportunity was afforded to further deal with it. It was then stated that the doctor no doubt desired to have the head for scientific reasons, and he had the skull in his surgery until the day the surgeon died. There was a publication in July 1918 naming the medical practitioner as Dr. William Callaghan. There was also a letter stating that a local man was present at the cemetery when Griffin's head was taken, and Robert H.D. White, manager of the Rockhampton branch of the Bank of New South Wales, was also in attendance. In 1922, the Melbourne newspaper The Australasian published an article about the removal of Griffin's head and said the unnamed perpetrators were three friends, a banker, a surgeon and an editor. Many years after the incident, he saw the skull displayed in a glass cabinet in the banker's drawing room. By that stage, the banker was a staid, elderly member of the cabinet. In 1928, The Australasian published another article confirming Dr. Callaghan's identity as the surgeon. There was also a fourth person named who participated, William Holland, known as Old Bill, who was the hospital wardsman. Holland had been a mariner, which explains the earlier reference to a surgeon and a mariner as the two men who carried out the beheading. It was claimed that Callaghan had kept the skull in his surgery and had been shown to the local man, Mr. Bird, on 2 or 3 occasions. Bird also provided details from a letter written in 1900 by Dr. Callaghan to the pastoralist John McCartney, in which the doctor invited McCartney to see Griffin's skull any time you call on me when in town. In his correspondence with McCartney, Callaghan also referred to the visit to Rockhampton several months after the grave robbery by the Premier of Queensland, Arthur Palmer. The doctor was at the wharf when the steamer from Brisbane arrived. Palmer greeted Callaghan and asked, "Have you a specimen of anatomy at your house?" And Callaghan replied in the affirmative. In his 1939 book, James Grant Patterson claimed Griffin's skull was kept in a glass case for many years but was damaged when one of the holder's children attempted to practice dentistry by smashing the lower jaw to obtain the teeth. Patterson claimed it was then passed on to the Rockhampton School of Arts in 1934. And a little about the two officers that were murdered. They'd known each other since childhood. They were both raised in the vicinity of Carrick-on-Suir Township, which straddles on the border between County Tipperary and County Waterford in southeast Ireland. In their formative years, both Cahill and Power received their education under the Cistercian Fathers at the Mount Mallory Seminary near Cappoquin in County Waterford. Patrick William Cahill was born in 1840 in Ballyneal, a rural district in the county of Tipperary, the son of William Cahill and Mary Lonigan. He was the eldest of 5 children, and his mother died in 1848. His father later remarried and had a further 11 children with his second wife. Cahill immigrated to Australia in about 1861 and held various positions in Victoria and New South Wales. In 1865, he met up with John Power in Brisbane, and the two young men formed a close friendship. Cahill was described as being nearly 6 foot tall, with dark hazel eyes and dark hair, and he was 27 years old when he was murdered by Thomas John Griffin. John Francis Power was baptised in February 1841 in County Tipperary. He was the son of Richard and Mary Power. Power immigrated to Australia aboard the Prince Consort, arriving at Brisbane on the 2nd of November 1862. His older brother Pierce was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest, and he travelled to Australia several months earlier. John Power was possessed of some capital. After remaining in Ipswich for some months, he and another man travelled to North Queensland in search of pastoral land, visiting the Sutter River district, inland from Mackay, and onto the Flinders Rivers region south of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Power eventually entered into a partnership managing a pastoral property on the Flinders River. In about August 1865, John Power met with his brother in Brisbane and accompanied him to Gander, north of Brisbane, where his brother was to take up a position of Catholic priest in that community. Father Pierce Power accidentally drowned in the Burnett River at Gander on the evening of 18th of October 1865, only after a few short weeks of arriving in the township. John Power was in Rockhampton when he heard of his brother's death, and the shock occasioned him to a severe illness, of which he eventually recovered. During his absence, Power's partner on Flinders River was said to have sold out and decamped with the money. Due to a sudden change in fortune, Power found himself obliged to seek other means of livelihood, and it was about this time he met up with Patrick Cahill in Brisbane, and the two decided to join the Queensland Police. Power was 26 years old when he was murdered by Thomas John Griffin. After they were murdered by Griffin, the bodies of the two troopers were wrapped in paper bark and buried by native police officers. The skulls of the murdered troopers were taken to Brisbane after Griffin's trial, but were later returned to Rockhampton to be interred with the bodies. Their bodies were later exhumed and reburied in the Rockhampton Cemetery. A public burial was held in Rockhampton for Cahill and Power on the 15th of July 1869, more than 20 months after their deaths. A service at the Roman Catholic Church was held before a procession made its way to the cemetery for burial, which included 3 volleys being fired over the grave at the conclusion of the service. The Queensland Police Service residences in the inner Brisbane suburb of Hurston are known as the Patrick William Cahill Unit and the John Francis Power Unit, named in Cahill and Power's honour. They were officially opened in August 2005 and provide accommodation to officers of the Queensland Police Service and their family members. In 2008, the story of the Cahill and Power murders were incorporated into a presentation at the Queensland Police Museum in Brisbane. The Queensland Water Police vessels, PW Cahill 1 and PW Cahill 2, stationed at the Whitsundays, were named in honour of Patrick William Cahill. And in July 2013, at the instigation of former Blackwater Police Officer, Senior Constable Donna Gilliland, memorial stones were placed at the Bedford Weir and plaques were erected on the graves of Cahill and Power in the South Rockhampton Cemetery. After Griffin's trial and execution, Elizabeth Otley married John Harcourt Wilkinson, an adjoining landowner, to the Otley family residence on the 12th of November 1870 at Rocklands, and the couple had 4 children. And what became of Harriet Griffin? In 1873, Harriet was a lodging house keeper to try and earn a living, and Harriet died on the 23rd of November 1888 in the Melbourne Benevolent Asylum at Hotham, aged 74. Her occupation at the time of her death was a nurse. Her cause of death was recorded as asthenia, which was weakness or lack of energy, from which she'd suffered from for a week before her death, and she was buried in the Melbourne General Cemetery. Her 2 boys, William and his wife, only stayed for a year and then they returned to Ireland. They'd had 1 child in Australia, but all up they had 7 children, and was an accountant, and he died in Ireland in 1918, aged 84. And the other son, George, stayed in Australia and married Fanny Farrow in Victoria in June 1864, when he was 25 and Fanny 16. They had 13 children and lived at Riddles Creek, then St Kilda, and in his old age farmed at Kennedy's Creek with his sons. And George died in 1912 at the age of 74. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Sergeant Griffin, who seemed to have everything laid out before him and all of the prospects in the world, but decided to make decisions based on gambling and greed in the end.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.